paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Steve Fuller. He holds a chair at the University of Warwick named after Auguste Comte, the father of sociology, and he's the author of 26 books. How you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing fine, Nick.
I did a crash course on Steve Fuller and his writings, and you span the gamut, which is it's kind of interesting to me. And you talk about the Huxleys, Julian Huxley, coining the word transhumanism in the 1950s. What motivated him to do that?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Julian Huxley, as you may know, right, is the brother of Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. And in many respects, that book, which everybody knows about, is kind of a satire about the sort of world that actually Julian Huxley thought would be good, which is one where we are able to basically genetically program people to order, as it were, according to where they should fit in society and so forth. So it was a kind of a eugenics program. But I think from the standpoint of transhumanism, kind of the broader issue, which also goes back to what all these Huxleys have been about since Thomas Henry, who was Darwin's bulldog, is that all these Huxleys, even though they're evolutionists and very substantial contributors to evolutionary theory, especially in the case of Julian Huxley, who wrote the first book on the modern evolutionary synthesis that was published in the UK. And he, nevertheless, he believed, like his grandfather believed, that evolution was not entirely a directionless process, but rather once Homo sapiens came on the scene, it was possible for a species not only to obey the laws of evolution, but to be able to direct them. So we obey and we know them. And because we know them, we now have a kind of obligation to direct them. And so this leads to eugenics, and in a sense, a very high grade kind of eugenics that started to come on stream after World War II, especially with the DNA revolution, the double helix from 1953. And Julian Huxley is still alive when all of that is happening, starts to get into what we call transhumanism today, where we're talking about not the crude methods of eugenics like sterilization and things like that, but now more sophisticated things of the sort that we nowadays associate with CRISPR, where one can do gene editing, right? And of course, we can talk about genetic enhancement through gene therapies. And all of that was kind of, in the forefront of what Julian Huxley had in mind, back in the 1950s. And he lived into the 1970s, I should say, and he was one of the champions of, for example, in vitro fertilization when that was coming on stream. So that's kind of you might say that's the prehistory of transhumanism as we understand it today, comes out of that tradition.
Julian Huxley argued that Homo sapiens are the only species equipped to comprehend the entire evolutionary process, in which case we incur a unique moral imperative and obligation to administer and direct its future course.
That's right.
He's a firm believer in humans. We have transcended Darwinism, and it's up to us to chart our course.
That's exactly right. I mean, and I think this has always been sort of, you might say, the puzzle behind the entire Huxley family, from the time of Thomas Henry, Darwin's friend, was that Darwin in a way leveled the distinction between humans and other animals. And so insofar as humans believed that they are exceptional creatures, right, once the theological argument is no longer on the table, then how are we going to reinscribe that exceptionalism within a biological framework? And that was kind of the quest of the Huxley family's been to do that. And that's why you end up with something like transhumanism in the 1950s.
And give us an example of transhumanism in the 1950s.
Well, I mean, Huxley is talking speculatively, but remember, once you have the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA, then the whole idea that genetics could be understood in terms of molecular biology becomes possible. I think people need to realize that our understanding of genetics prior to that point, prior to the DNA revolution, was actually relatively crude. And in fact, if you look at the way in which eugenics was practiced, right, in the first half of the 20th century, I think crude is exactly the word for it. But what you started to begin to realize after 1953 was that, in fact, the interventions could be much more strategic, much more fine grained at the molecular level, right? So, when we talk about modifying the genome these days, right, the very possibility that that could take place suddenly came on the horizon after the DNA revolution. And I think this is when transhumanism really starts to take off, because you start to begin to get a kind of concrete sense that maybe it is possible to design human beings, right? In other words, once as we learn more about the genetic markers for various kinds of human characteristics, and we understand the molecular biology that underwrites it, that in fact we might actually be able, to do the kinds of things that, let's say, somebody like H.G. Wells was just dreaming about, right, in the early 20th century.
It's interesting. You weave theological arguments into transhumanism. And you say that the core of our history is theological. Our zeal for scientific transcendence is shaped by a widely shared modern vision of the human relationship to the divine and to nature. Science enables us to know dimensions of reality we will never experience with our bodily senses, from the hidden world of cells to distant black holes. It provides an infinity of applications that extend our powers beyond the limits of beyond our biologically given bodies. So what you're saying there is we've already jumped into a transhuman universe. Just our understanding of the world and the cosmos, we're already there.
Yeah, I think the mindset is already there. Yes, I mean, because if you think about the most distinctive contributions that have been made in the history of science, especially if you look at the physical sciences, which are normally seen as the vanguard of the sciences generally, it's been about extending our understanding of places that we've never experienced firsthand, and there's even a good chance we never will. So we're talking about cosmology, right? We're talking about having universal laws that apply everywhere in the universe. And while of course we do empirical observations and stuff like that, we also do an enormous amount of speculative theorizing, which then gets tested against the observations. And the thing that's so remarkable is that these very widespread kind of conceptual artifacts that we create with mathematics normally, they turn out to be true, right? They turn out to be applicable, and they're applicable to a world of space and time that goes well beyond the actual experience of the embodied human being, right? This is the transcendence aspect of science, right? Science is not just, as it were, a sort of a souped up version of the kind of knowledge you need to get around the world as we normally experience it. No, science is actually a higher order knowledge that, in a sense, tries to capture all of reality, regardless, even if we're only experiencing a very small part of it, but all of reality under one kind of theoretical framework. And this is why physicists, even atheistic physicists such as Stephen Hawking, will talk about the quest of physics to get into the mind of God, right? Because it's from God's point of view that something like a kind of physical universe closed under a set of laws makes sense. Why would anyone think of such a thing, right? You don't need to think of such a thing in order to survive in the world. Yet this has become the hallmark of human knowledge, at least for the past 300 years.
Einstein said that too. I want to know the mind of God. And it's kind of interesting. This is a little off the path, but he was very fond of Spinoza. Yeah. And Spinoza was a pantheist, and Einstein would have, E equals MC squared indicates pantheism. But I thought that was kind of interesting that Stephen Hawking is ripping off quotes from Albert Einstein, who's a good guy to rip quotes off from, I guess.
Oh, this idea of the mind of God, that that doing science is about getting into the mind of God actually goes back to the Middle Ages. You can find this in Saint Bonaventure, and Newton mentions it as well. So within that whole Christian tradition that leads to the origin of modern science, I mean, you definitely find this kind of thinking going on.
Another one of my icons has been dashed. I thought it was Albert Einstein that came up with that.
Oh, well, but the thing is, the interesting point that you raise with regard to Einstein is it's interesting to think about what sort of God do they have in mind when they say you're getting into the mind of God, because obviously Spinoza's God, who is not a personal God, right? It's a God that's basically coextensive with physical reality, right? Is quite different from Newton's God, who is a personal God, right? A creator. And so it's interesting when people say the mind of God, they might not necessarily be talking about the same God.
You wrote a book, Knowledge, the Philosophic Quest in History. And you said that science unequivocally demonstrates the divinity of human beings, or to be more accurate, that humans somehow are not part and parcel of nature. Humans have transcended Darwinism. The true mission of the unified institution of science in its religious core is the purest good news of the transhumanist kingdom. And then you say, humans are gods in the making. What do you mean by humans are gods in the making?
Well, I think the first thing, and this kind of goes to, you might say, the connection between the quest for scientific knowledge, and the Abrahamic religions. And, so by the Abrahamic religions, I mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they have, first of all, they agree certainly on the idea that human beings are privileged creatures in the eyes of God. And to varying degrees, they endorse the idea that humans are created in the image and likeness of God. Now, so there's that. But of course, one of the things that they also agree on, these Abrahamic religions, is that we're fallen creatures, right? So in a sense, we in a sense kind of destroyed our divine entitlement to a certain extent, right? With the fall of Adam, right? This is also part of the story. So you've got these two kind of countervailing conceptions of the human that exist right at the beginning of these two religions. One where there is this divine privilege, right? This entitlement, in the eyes of God. But then, once humans kind of get on the scene, they blow it, right? And they get into a fallen state. And then the question is going to be how they make up the difference. How do they get back, right? And the whole salvation story of the Abrahamic religions is about, in some way, regaining the divine entitlement, with God involved and to varying degrees. And, there's a lot of theological discussion about that. But the point is, it ends up creating a very mixed image of what a human being is. And so a human being is a fallen God, not a raised animal, right? This is the bottom line as far as I'm concerned, because I think if you start with the Darwinian perspective, and you ask what is a human being, you're going to start by saying human being's an animal, but let's say a higher order animal, right? That's the way they used to talk. But what I'm saying is that in fact, a human being is a kind of fallen God. Right. And then the question is, how do you regain the advantage? And I think and historically speaking, it was from that perspective, the idea that we are fallen gods, that actually motivated people in the late Middle Ages and the early modern era to actually start to do the kind of bold theorization and experimentation that led to the rise of modern science. So if you look at guys, whether we're talking about Francis Bacon or Galileo or Copernicus or Kepler or Newton or, you just name them, Descartes, right? All of these guys are basically kind of heretical Christians. Right. I mean, so the point is they're both, right. So they're not atheists, right. But they're certainly not, as it were, institutional establishment people. And of course, the Protestant Reformation makes a big difference in all this, because the Protestant Reformation, in a way, makes very public and very, very visible, and in a way, very tolerable, a kind of differentiation of views within Christianity, which actually allows science to flourish, right? So the kind of pluralism that it gets introduced by the Protestant Reformation makes a big difference in creating a kind of cultural environment hospitable to the sort of radical views that these early founders of science were promoting, right? But it was still under a theological framework. This is the point, under a theological understanding of what a human being is.
And actually, you say that Jesus gave us a special dispensation.
Well, I mean,
which I thought was kind of interesting, because you don't strike me as a Christian. I mean, I've looked at your thoughts.
Well, I was actually trained by the Jesuits, so maybe that doesn't count me as a Christian. But
Okay.
but no, I actually had serious Jesuit training until I went to university, and I'm very I mean, as you could tell from my writings, whatever you think about my religious beliefs, I'm very interested in, and I think knowledgeable about theology, and I think it's a very important field. Okay, I mean, we could spend all day arguing about whether I'm a Christian or not. I mean, but I don't think it matters that much. But I do take the theology very seriously, and I think people who don't take it seriously are a bit kind of tone deaf to history and don't really understand why people early on, before science came up with any actual results, got very enthusiastic about doing science. Okay, because here's the thing. We now live 300 years after the scientific revolution, 400 years, and it's easy to understand now why science was such a big deal, because we see the fruits of science, right? We see the kind of world that we live in is basically, organized according to a scientific infrastructure. But supposing you're living in the 17th century, what's the argument for doing all these very radical experiments, the outcomes of which were always counterintuitive to the common sense view of the world, which at that time, of course, was represented by Aristotle, and the way the Bible was sort of understood through Aristotle. Okay, and so all of this science that was happening back then, right? So for the most obvious example being the idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe, that the Earth moves. It's not stationary, right? That goes completely counter to common sense. And that was just one of many kinds of ways of studying the world and results that were being found. And so you have to ask yourself, before you see the payoff of this, in other words, before you see how this can actually be applied and kind of do something really amazing to the world, why would you believe such stuff? Right. And this was precisely the kind of issue that Galileo found himself in when he was before the Inquisition in the early 17th century. Right. Because Galileo just had this kind of goofy telescope, which was really a jacked up toy. Right. And he was doing all these kind of strange experiments, which people weren't even sure whether he did them. Yet on the back of that, Galileo was giving this kind of completely alternative view of the world that was supporting Copernicus, who was seen as this kind of radical Polish monk, right? And so the people who were, the inquisitors in Rome, looking at a guy like that, saying, Galileo, he's a self-promoter, he's trying to get a little, because he did have a history of being like that. And he's overstating his case, basically. It's hype, right? And so they didn't believe him. And it was only with Newton and the subsequent generations who took Galileo seriously, it was only then that people began to realize, oh yeah, there's something here. But the thing is, what made people enthusiastic in the beginning, before the proof was there, had a lot to do with how the human beings, the people of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, thought about themselves as human beings. They thought they actually within themselves had the power to potentially understand the entire universe. And that's a very powerful idea that will motivate you.
It's interesting, when Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter and saw the moons going around Jupiter, he was the first human to know that he wasn't living in a Ptolemy centric world. And I always thought, I wonder how that would make a guy feel.
Well, it wasn't that simple. If you were back there in the early 17th century and you were,
I know.
If you had a front row seat during the Inquisition, and you were watching the way he was being interrogated, one of the things, of course, that they brought up was the nature of the telescope. Right? Remember, the telescope was a toy. The telescope was a toy that Galileo repurposed, right, in order to see farther distances, because the telescope is basically a jacked up periscope. And he put additional lenses and things like this so it could see farther. And he was making all kinds of claims for, that the stuff that you saw on the other end of the telescope wasn't just an optical illusion, but was actually the moons of Jupiter or the craters on the moon or whatever, right? Things that you cannot see with the naked eye, but you could see through the telescope. The big problem, well, there were a couple of big problems. One, with the lenses weren't all that great. So when you actually looked at the lenses, you saw they were scratched and so forth. So there was a kind of a technical problem in that level. But at a more profound level, and this is where it's interesting, Galileo didn't actually have an optical theory that could explain why the telescope was able to make such distant objects close in a reliable manner, right? Because the moons of Jupiter are way out there, right? And you might claim, I looked through the telescope and I'm seeing the moons of Jupiter, but what is it about optics? What is it about this telescope? How is it applying the laws of optics to be able to do that, right? You don't get he doesn't have an optical theory. I mean, and so that kills him, right? That kills him on the day, you might say, right? Because he can't explain why the telescope works, basically. And so even though he's making these wonderful claims and people are believing him, right? This is why he is brought to the Inquisition. It's not like people aren't believing him. But the point is, these Inquisition guys, they're scientifically trained, at least by the standards of their day, and they would expect that there would be a theoretical explanation for why the instrument works. And he couldn't provide it. So I do see at that point, this is what I would say to you and the listeners, right? This is where the moment of faith comes in, right? The fact that even though Galileo cannot explain why the telescope works, he's probably right. And what we need to do is to figure out why the telescope works and not think that the telescope is just some con trick, right? I mean, and that is the faith in science. That is the faith in science, that it's not pure magic.
You bring in Pierre Desjardins, speaking of Jesuits, and
yes,
it's interesting. He talked about he believed in evolution and also a physical, but a spiritual evolution. And we were going towards an apotheosis, which he called omega point. And from what I can discern from your writing, you think that apotheosis can be attained through science.
Yeah, and but Teilhard did too, right? Teilhard is one of these guys who didn't think that science and theology conflicted at all. In fact, he has a tendency in his writings to sort of read one through the other, which is one of the reasons why he was seen as kind of weird in his day. And as you know, he was put on the index of prohibited books by the Catholic Church until he died. And by the way, right, when he died, right, the people who were promoting to get his books into print were Julian Huxley. That he was one. He was a friend, correspondent of Teilhard. And the other person was another one of the founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis, Theodosius Dobzhansky, a Ukrainian geneticist who taught for many years at Columbia University, and in fact was the teacher of some of the famous evolutionary biologists that you may have heard of. I suppose the most famous one would be Richard Lewontin, who worked with Stephen Jay Gould, right? And he was a student of this guy Dobzhansky. And the interesting thing about Dobzhansky was a practicing Ukrainian Orthodox Christian. And he even wrote a book in the 1960s called The Biology of Ultimate Concern, which was basically bringing up to date the Teilhardian picture in light of the developments in molecular biology and so forth that had taken place in the 1950s and 60s.
And you get into morphological freedom.
Oh, yeah.
Could you explain morphological freedom to us?
Okay, so when we start talking about this concept, right, which is a concept, from the 1990s, so it's from the new wave transhumanism that is really the dominant form today, because, what we've been talking about up to this point under the name of transhumanism, very often contemporary transhumanists like to forget because it does have an association with eugenics and it's, and even, with a kind of directed evolution and transhumanists typically want to create a little bit of distance there. But morphological freedom is definitely a concept of the sort of new transhumanism that starts coming on stream in the 1990s. And so if you think about people like Max Moore, right, or Nick Bostrom, people like Ray Kurzweil, right? I mean, all these people who are now part of the main scene in transhumanism. And what it does is it does give you a sense of a somewhat shift in focus that's taken place in transhumanism since the time of Huxley. Because like I say, Huxley is pretty much a biological guy, right? For Huxley, all the evolution, all the transhumanization is going to happen somehow through genetic modification or something like that to Homo sapiens. That's exactly the horizon that he's got. But when we talk about morphological freedom, we're actually talking about something where we're sort of imagining that the transhuman of the future might be embodied in different sorts of ways. So for example, it need not be biological in the Homo sapiens sense, right? It could, for example, if you take Ray Kurzweil seriously, right, it could be uploading consciousness, right, into a machine, right, and this consciousness, as it were, has the essence of your personality or whatever. I mean, intelligence, right, and then it merges, right, with all the computer circuits, and it gets amplified into infinity, right? This is the singularity, and so there is that aspect of morphological freedom, where in some sense, the human migrates from the ape into the machine, right? But also there are kind of halfway house positions, you might say, and so when we talk about cyborgs, okay, and a cyborg is basically this kind of hybrid between biological and a silicon-based being, right? And we can think about this in many different ways. We can think about it, obviously, in terms of prosthetic devices, right? Where we have like actually technological extensions of ourselves, right? But you can also think in terms of silicon chip implants, right? I mean, there are a lot, you could think about Neuralink, Elon Musk's Neuralink, right, as a kind of cyborganization mechanism, right? So the whole cyborg process might be a bit like Batman, right, where you could put on the stuff and get the transhuman powers, and then you could take them off again, right? So they're all, but all of that stuff that we're talking about now, right, would fall under the rubric of morphological freedom. And the thing that's interesting about it, I would say, especially to people, your listeners who may not be familiar with this stuff at all, is it's also very closely tied to a kind of political libertarianism, right? So if libertarianism is, the idea that I want to live the way I want to live, right, and I don't want the government to tell me what to do, blah, 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 well, you take it the next step up, right, which is to say, I want to be embodied the way I want. And so actually, one of the interesting kinds of synergies that you see in the 1990s in this beginning of the new wave transhumanism is a kind of synergy between transhumanism, and transgender. Okay, and there's this very famous transhumanist who is a transgender activist called Martine Rothblatt, who in fact is promotes this kind of idea, right? And this is part of the freedom to be, the freedom to be in whatever embodiment you want.
So we get into two diametric principles here. We've got the proactionary principle, which you're in favor of, and then we've got the precautionary principle, which was proposed by Leon Kass. He was on the President's Council on Bioethics. Tell us a little bit about how those two work out.
Okay, so the idea here is we're talking about attitudes toward risk. Okay. And so we start with the assumption, which I think is a assumption that most people will accept, is that we live in highly uncertain and indeterminate times. And whether it's more uncertain or indeterminate than in the past is not really the question. It's rather that psychologically speaking, people see the world this way, and this then puts us in a position of risk, right, where risk is somehow. You're in a situation of risk when you have to take a decision where there is all this uncertainty around, right? And so there are two general attitudes toward this situation. One attitude, which is the precautionary attitude, and it's an attitude that you find a lot, not only in, I mean, you're right, Leon Kass and Bush's bioethics panel, right, is kind of is a good example of that, right? Which is basically against scientific adventurism, you might say, right? It's so in the case that you were referring to with Leon Kass, the report of the interim report of Bush's bioethics panel in 2004 basically led to the banning of federally funded stem cell research, right? And it was, first of all, there was this premise that a stem cell is a living thing. Okay, so we have that kind of thing going on. But on top of that, there was also the point, which is a correct point, right, that in order to, that you actually, in a sense, have to sacrifice a lot of stem cells before you actually get one doing what you want it to do in terms of the organ you want it to grow into or something, right? And so the precautionary principle basically is a principle that is aimed primarily at avoiding harm, right? Even if through some harm you might get a greater benefit, right? I mean, and that's the key thing, right? Because so much of the innovation that has managed to transform humanity, not only in science, but of course in technology as well, has been very risky in the sense that it usually has involved a certain amount of harm, right? A short-term harm, but then in the long term, right, you actually start seeing the benefits come in. And this is certainly true if you look at, let's say, the research, animal research, animal-based research is a good example of this, where a lot of animals have been sacrificed. None of these, to make major breakthroughs, none of these experiments would ever be conducted today, but then those breakthroughs would never have been made. Right. And the same is also true with the psychological experiments that were done, into the 1960s and 70s, right? That they would not be allowed today either. Right. So they're all this kind of stuff because there is a certain amount of harm that's caused, even though the benefit that was gained by it was quite substantial. Now, the proactionary principle comes at it the opposite way, right? The proactionary principle, if I may put it crudely, is a kind of no pain, no gain principle, right? Namely, that as Stalin is reputed to have said, you cannot make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. This has often been kind of the entrepreneurial kind of attitude toward things, right? Where you got to break the rules. You have to kind of smash things, right? So you have to in some way transcend the limitations. And when you're in an uncertain, indeterminate environment, that's an ideal place, right? Because then everybody is kind of, doesn't know where to go. And so that's the time when you could turn this risk into an opportunity to make a genuine innovation. And the proactionary principle basically says this is the way we ought to govern the world, right? And that in fact, all of the progress that we've made in the modern era has been on the back of a proactionary attitude. And so one of the reasons why a lot of people, Peter Thiel is a very famous one who says this, but he's not the only one by any means, that there's been a scientific and technological stagnation since about 1970. Okay. And that, in a sense, all the innovations were made up to then. And what happens at that point? Well, you start to see a lot of, ethics constraints being institutionally introduced, right? Making it more and more difficult to do risky research, right? A lot of other sorts of things start to come into play, which in a sense slows down and mitigates kind of the course of progress. And so transhumanists are actually very sensitive to this point. And in a way, the proactionary precautionary principle really starts to come on stream as a kind of opposition immediately after the Leon Kass thing that you mentioned, because there was a serious concern on the part of this new wave of transhumanists that the federal government under George W. Bush might actually be hell-bent on stopping scientific progress altogether, right? So this, in a sense, this is how the new transhumanism came in. And so this partly explains why the political cast of today's transhumanism tends to be libertarian, anti-statist, right? Because if you think about Julian Huxley's transhumanism, the kind that Aldous Huxley satirized in Brave New World, that was a transhumanism done by the state, right? The eugenics projects were always projects done by the state, right? But this kind of transhumanism that we have now with the proactionary imperative, as a response to Leon Kass, is very libertarian. It's very anti-statist. And that's the reason, because there is this fear that it's the big government that's in fact shutting down progress.
It's interesting. Proactionary principle comes from Max Moore, who is now the CEO of Alcor, the leading U.S. cryogenics company. And Alcor, in one of its freezers, has the head of Ted Williams. I always thought that was kind of interesting.
All right.
So proactionaries believe that by restricting risk-taking, it puts humanity at greater risk, as we are prevented from the sort of radical experiments that in the past have resulted in major leaps of knowledge.
Yeah, see, I think you're raising an interesting point here, because I think when we use terms, so if you think about the discourse of the precautionary principle, the opposing side, right, which the environmentalists use a lot, right? We talk about things like sustainable development, right? We talk about getting the world in harmony or in equilibrium or something like that. And I think if you hold the proactionary point of view, you don't think this is possible, right? So in other words, there is no such thing. I mean, there's no such thing as balance or equilibrium or anything like that, right? The world, you know, and reality is always in a dynamic state. And so in a sense, you always have to be moving. You cannot think about some kind of situation where you get a steady state world, which often seems to be what a lot of the environmentalists, when they invoke the precautionary principle, are trying to talk about. I mean, one, you know, as a historical point, even before, you know, while Leon Kass, to a large extent, popularized the precautionary principle in the recent past, the actual principle goes back to Germany in the early 19th century, where it was a principle of tree replacement. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, when it was moving into Germany, right? And so you have all this forested land, right, in Germany, and it was quickly being, the trees were being chopped down to turn into towns and factories and all the rest of it, right? So there was this kind of principle of forestry, right, that said basically that if you got to chop down X number of trees, you got to plant X number of trees, right? And that's because you have to keep some kind of steady state in the environment. Otherwise, there will be environmental chaos, right? And I think we're familiar with this kind of principle, you know, very much in the modern period. But proactionary principle denies the premise of that, right? The proactionary principle doesn't believe there's such a thing as steady state anything, especially if you believe in evolution. Right? If you believe in evolution, right? One of the you know, whatever kind of evolution you believe in, it's dynamic, right? Things are always changing. And so there's a question then about how do you respond to the change? And the worst thing to do is to try to stop change. The question is, how do you ride with the change, right? But not stopping the change. And that's why the proactionary principle is dead set against the precautionary principle.
In Humanity 2.0, you wrote that the march of progress is itself morally cleansing as we are learning from our mistakes. And here's a quote from the book: "Errors are unavoidable in the quest to extend human knowledge."
Yeah.
So there's going to be some carnage because we're moving forward.
Yeah, I that is correct. And you see, this gets us into very deep waters, actually, and it's something that I do think a lot about. And I'll just throw a term on the table that your listeners might find interesting, and that's the term theodicy, which is a branch of theology that deals with justifying God's ways to men, as it used to be put, right? So, and what it means in practice is trying to explain why evil exists in the world if God is the, you know, ultimately good, ultimately powerful, ultimately knowing being, right? Why is the world so full of misery that never seems to end? And the misery comes in the form of what humans do to each other and what nature does to humans and what humans do to nature. And so there just seems to be so much misery. And yet it's somehow compatible with this view that you know, that God is this wonderful being, right? And so the kinds of answers that got developed to this question, which get secularized over time, really have a lot to do with the fact that we need to take a longer time horizon when trying to understand whether something that's happened is good or bad. That it's very difficult to make a judgment call just at the moment the thing happens. And very often it just takes a long. So a lot of things that, let's say, initially might have seemed really bad, right? Over time, you start to realize that maybe, you know, what was done at that time actually enabled something good down the road that wouldn't have happened otherwise had that bad thing not happened originally, right? And vice versa, of course. Things that seemed really good at the time, right, as you look, you know, into the future, you begin to realize maybe this was not such a good thing to do. And so moral judgments, in fact, do change over time. And I do think, you know, I think this is a very important way to approach the kinds of issues, you know, that you know, people like Leon Kass and other ethicists, you know, are worried about when they think about transhumanism, because so much of the critique of transhumanism from the moral side has a lot to do with the prima facie moral abomination of transhumanism, right? You know, that in some way we're radically changing the human body, you know, we're allowing in principle people to die in experiments, right? All of this kind of stuff, you know, and that this is prima facie bad, right? It offends our moral intuitions. And Leon Kass actually talks this way, right? This is exactly how he argues. But my point in the book, and what I would urge on your listeners, is that in fact we need to morally evaluate these claims of transhumanism from a much longer perspective, and that we should reserve judgment in a sense, right? In other words, very often what we're talking about when we're opposing transhumanism is we're opposing certain ideas, certain policies, certain projects, but in terms of what's actually on the ground, right, there isn't that much. And so I do think one needs to be open-minded about this stuff and to think about it in kind of the broadest frame possible. And that's my general view. So I'm a very, people position me differently with regard to transhumanism. I'm certainly sympathetic to it. I'm not uncritical of it, but I do think that it tends not to be evaluated properly, in the sense that I think people are a bit simple-minded from the standpoint of the moral judgments they make about it.
This is from your knowledge, the philosophic quest in history. We must somehow believe that all the human and non-human lives lost through science-induced aggression, negligence, obliviousness, have contributed to a world that has maximized the welfare of one or more humans, and understood as the highest, as we move towards the highest life form. So basically what you're saying is that, and this is kind of a variation on the theme that you just talked about, that there's going to be carnage, but it's ultimately for the good.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say, of course, I don't believe anything goes, right, in the sense that you could just, do whatever you want. But I do, and that's where it gets kind of interesting, right? In other words, what is the limits to what I'm saying, right? What are the limits? How much carnage justifies how much good, right? And I do think we need to have serious conversations about that, right? But as long as we've got a precautionary principle on the table, it's going to be very difficult to have that conversation, because the precautionary principle wants no carnage at all, right? And I don't think we can live in a world without carnage, right? So this is where it gets kind of interesting. But it's an issue that needs to be discussed more. Namely, what are the limits to the carnage, you might say, right? And one, of course, should not be glib about it, but one should be open and say, this is what we're talking about. So let me give you an example of concretely. So the book that I wrote, called The Proactionary Imperative, that book, I talk in one of the later chapters, I talk about the idea that that people should be allowed to actually enter into individual private contracts with scientists to do risky experiments, right? Where there's kind of informed consent and everything. But the point is that if the individual, is, first of all, if the individual's qualified, but from the scientific, where the scientist is satisfied with the individual, but also where the individual understands enough of the risks that's going on, and maybe there's some kind of insurance policy in case there is some harm, that the individual who suffers the harm in the experiment will be compensated, right? But this would be arranged as a kind of private contract. There wouldn't be an institutional safeguard, because the problem at the moment is risky experiments with human beings are very hard to conduct, because there are institutional prohibitions. So even if the people want to do the experiments, right, and want to participate in the experiments, they are prevented by universities and other kinds of authorities from doing so. And so my proposal, right, is that we should be allowing these kinds of individual contracts. And one of the consequences of this, of course, will be that some people will die in the experiments, right, or be seriously damaged in some way. And that, my view is that people should be allowed in an informed way to contract into that kind of risky situation. And, what I compare it to in the book is I compare it to people who go into the military. They go into the military, right? And so if we thought about science, contributing to science, right, as something comparable to patriotism, right, where people go into the military because they want to serve their country, even though they know perfectly well that there's a good chance they're going to get killed, right, if a war breaks out. That it would be in that kind of spirit, you see, that one might want to, voluntarily, as it were, participate in a risky scientific experiment. That's the kind of thing I think we should be putting on the table.
It's interesting. we have no idea where humanity is going to be in 500 years, but it's going to look a lot different than it looks now. I mean, just in our lifetimes, the internet, I mean, it's facilitated knowledge, the collection of knowledge, unlike anything that's ever even come close to it. But here's my problem. When you've got science and technology and economics together, you can create a Frankenstein. Or when you've got the military industrial complex like DARPA, those guys in their, white smocks and and dark hearts, that's where I worry about it. And there's a number of examples. You've got the Tuskegee syphilis study,
Sure.
which the people that were facilitating that research knew that they were going to be hurting people. MK Ultra with Ewan Cameron, who is basically wiping people's hard drives. I mean, that wasn't really done. I mean, I would say aggression or obliviousness, one or the other. I mean, you've got IBM punch cards facilitating the Holocaust, which is definitely aggression. But then there's examples of like radium. We thought when radium came around, we thought it was the best thing. Radium was in toothpaste, soap, razor blades, and who knows how many people got cancer from that. So these are examples of science that's kind of jumped the track. And how can we avoid that?
Well, I think there are different answers to the examples you raise. I think need to be treated somewhat differently. I do think with stuff like the radium example, that's inevitable in the sense that the full consequences, especially if we're talking about a relatively new element or a relatively new something, even if it passes, government safeguards at a certain kind of level, right? It still will be passing those safeguards at a relatively early period of use. And so when the thing gets used in more context over a longer period of time, you might see things develop that you never would have anticipated. And that's just, I'm afraid that's kind of normal, right? That there is that kind of risk that comes with any kind of discovery or innovation, right? That you might not see the bad effects for a long time. But I think with the cases that you were raising with Ewan Cameron and with the Tuskegee Institute and all of that stuff, I think there's a question of the informed consent business, right? So in all those cases that you listed initially, for for various reasons, not the same reason, the subjects really were not in a position to offer consent in the proper way, in a properly informed, free way. And I would say that's the main problem, right, with that, right? And that's why, in the response to the earlier question, I really made a big point about saying that we need, legally binding contractual arrangements where in the contracts that people sign up to participate in risky experiments, they know exactly what they're getting into and they're not being forced to get into it. They get into it voluntarily. Right. And I think that is a very important point, because I think with a lot of this stuff that involves human subjects in the past, there just wasn't the informed consent. And I think what's happened now in response to all of those earlier examples, we've kind of gone the other way, right? We've sort of gone to the other extreme, and now we've made it virtually impossible, right, for anyone to get involved in risky experiments, even if they have been informed. So that's how I would deal with those. So I mean, it's I think also the other point to make is that in a sense, when you commit yourself to living in a scientific world, you are committed to the idea that new discoveries, innovations, and so forth will potentially radically transform the way we live, right? So in a sense, we're privileging that capacity of science. Right. And so that's a kind of fundamental choice in a sense that we have to make about living in a scientific world, namely that we, by definition, we have to absorb the level of risk that comes from regularly being innovative. Because let's put it this way, we could have another attitude toward this. And it would be an attitude kind of like the way the Middle Ages operated. See, in the Middle Ages, I mean, what people often don't realize is that a lot of the, especially with a lot of the physical and mathematical ideas that became very important in the scientific revolution, many of them were already present in the Middle Ages. Okay, the ideas were already there. They didn't have to be cooked up from scratch. The problem was that the people in the Middle Ages, when they were talking about these ideas, that's all they were doing. They were just talking about them, right? They were treating them as philosophy, right? They weren't treating them as actionable. And this is the thing that makes science such a transformative thing. It takes these very radical ideas that very often begin in, in the abstractions of mathematics and so forth, and actually tries to, realize them in the world, right? First through experimentation and then through technological application. And that is the radicalizing nature of science. It really takes very seriously the power of the human mind to materialize in the world and to transform the world in the process. And that is, by definition, going to be a risky enterprise.
And there was the Transhumanist Declaration of 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And it had 8 postulates. And the first one is humanity stands to be profoundly affected by science and technology. In the future, we envision the possibility of broadening human potential by overcoming aging, cognitive shortcomings, involuntary suffering, and our confinement to planet Earth. So do transhumanists want to live forever? Is it not die? Is that?
Some of them, that's definitely on the agenda for some of them. And to be honest with you, I think if you want to look at the funding, right? Because I mean, the point of what we would call the most distinctive types of transhumanist research, which you kind of alluded to just now, most of the funding for that is private. And so let's put it this way: if there weren't a few billionaires who wanted to live forever, I doubt that living forever would be so high on the transhumanist agenda. And in fact, when I talk to people about transhumanism, and transhumanism makes a lot of proposals about various things, and then whenever I get to that one, right, about living forever, who wants to live forever, right? You ask a room of ordinary people, people who are just hearing about transhumanism for the first time, and I'm telling them what's about. And this, by the way, this could be adults or children, because I asked children about this too, and it's very interesting to hear what children say on the matter. I never get more than 25% of the people in the room saying they want to live forever. Never more than 25%. Okay. And when you talk to kids, it's lower. Okay. It's lower. And in fact, there is a general view about this position of transhumanism that it's selfish, right? That it's selfish, that people kind of, and look, there is a kind of sense to that critique, because transhumanists aren't known for having a lot of kids, because they think they're going to be able to do it all in their overextended lifetimes, right? So you don't have to kind of imagine, oh, my child will be able to do this, right? No, you just, if you're going to live 200, 300, 400 years, right, you'll have enough time to do everything, especially if you have the kind of physical fitness and mental fitness that transhumanists are imagining is going to be part of this longevity. So they're not imagining longevity with decrepitude, right? They're imagining, 35 forever.
It's interesting to me that this is it's a fundamental issue with transhumanism, is life eternal. And when we talk about the Enlightenment and Darwinism, we have Nietzsche basically declaring God is dead. And as I think transhumanism moves forward, and science becomes science is the predominant religion today in our society. I believe that. When God is dead, people are going to, you call it the God-sized hole. And people are going to have to fill that God-sized hole with something. And you bring up, and this was kind of interesting to me, you bring up a couple of existential philosophers, first Sartre and then Heidegger. Could you tell us about the God-shaped hole and how Sartre and Heidegger can ameliorate that?
Well, I mean, this is very complicated, I think, because what we're dealing with is basically a couple of guys who declared themselves to be atheists, but in fact are very obsessed with this God-shaped hole. I mean, I think with Sartre, I think it's kind of easier. um, in a way, part of the way I think about this, I forget exactly the context in the book, but I do think about these two thinkers sort of together as holding somewhat complementary views, because
Yes.
so Sartre is someone who I would say. So let me draw a distinction, which hasn't come up yet, but is kind of relevant to this. There's a distinction that's often made between transhumanism and posthumanism. Okay, and transhumanism is basically about kind of the boosting of the human. And if you think that the human originally was born in the image and likeness of God and God disappears, then the human immediately fills the hole, right? That's kind of the logic of the argument. And Sartre, I think, is attracted to that, at least insofar as his thinking about moral responsibility, right? So Sartre is very famous, for thinking that after Hiroshima, all of humanity has blood in its hands, right? Not just the physicists in Los Alamos, but everybody does, right? And it's all of our, we were all complicit in this, right? And we were all complicit in the Holocaust. We were all complicit in everything. And he, part of his argument is basically insofar as we allowed it to happen. Right. So it's not like we pressed the button and the atomic bomb happened, but rather the fact that we didn't stop it. Right. The fact that we didn't stop the Holocaust, the fact that we didn't stop stuff, right. This idea of negative responsibility is very key to the sort of Sartrean ethic. And that kind of idea of thinking about moral responsibility in such globalizing terms has a lot to do with Sartre's view, I think, that in a sense, our moral responsibility is godlike, right? That we are, so everything should matter to us, right? As if we were God. And this is why Sartre's self-image, if you recall Sartre, who was still alive when I was a kid, Sartre was the engagé, right, French intellectual who was, marching with the students and was going to Vietnam and, was doing all this kind of stuff and was always showing his kind of moral, like Noam Chomsky does today, basically, right? I mean, that's he kind of, he thinks and feels for the world kind of thing. And so that's one way of looking at it, right? But then there's this other way of looking at it, of the God-shaped hole, and just say, well, look, and this, and in a way, and Nietzsche kind of plays both sides of this game. But you might say, well, the death of God is the death of the human, right? In the sense that the human doesn't matter anymore, right? Because in a sense, the human only was so special insofar as it was created in the image and likeness of God. But once you remove God, humans lose their privilege. And this is what posthumanism is about. And so posthumanism is a really opposite view to transhumanism. And I think Heidegger is often seen as a kind of poster boy for posthumanism, because Heidegger, in a way, thinks that what matters is being in the world. And being in the world, you might say, is a kind of species neutral thing, right? It's something closer to living, right? Existing, right? It's closer to that. And it doesn't privilege the human in any of this. So posthumanism, for example, tends to be very friendly to environmental concerns, right? And indeed, they tend to be very much of the opinion that if you wanted to talk about the source of most of the misery in the world, you'd point the figure at Homo sapiens, right? That Homo sapiens, and the Anthropocene, which is this era we supposedly live in geological terms, whereby human beings are the primary cause of climate change, right? Which has supposedly happened since the Industrial Revolution, when the carbon emissions start to spike. That this is a damning thing, right? This is regarded as a damning thing, that human beings, in a way, dominate the planet so much and largely as in a self-aggrandizing way, because we've thought we are God and we have control over everything. But once God is gone, we don't have that entitlement. And so we need to recede from the scene. Humanity has to recede. It cannot have this carbon footprint. It cannot be so substantial. And so Heidegger often looks very good in this context, because, like I say, for Heidegger, it's about being in the world. And Heidegger's fundamental kind of disposition on this is that our being in the world is something that we're thrown into, right? So in other words, agency isn't really the name of the game here, but rather it's situatedness, right? It's contextualization. It's where you are in relation to others, right? And this is very much more a kind of post-human, ecological kind of perspective. And you see, that's what happens when God dies, right? When God dies, the human recedes, and it becomes, as it were, just one of many species on a planet, right? And so those are two quite radically, I would say, even though they're both called existentialists, Sartre and Heidegger, nevertheless, I see them as really having quite different takes of what the death of God thesis means for humanity.
I saw that you wrote a book comparing and contrasting Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper. And it's kind of interesting. I had, as a philosophy undergraduate student, one of my final exams was compare and contrast Kuhn and Popper. And you said Popper believes that science progresses slowly and gradually, and it's cumulative. And Kuhn believes in paradigm shifts. Paradigm shift comes from Thomas Kuhn, where an example of a paradigm shift is Ptolemaic astronomy, where the Earth is in the center. And then there was a paradigm shift because of Copernicus and Kepler, where our universe was heliocentric. So, given what you have written, do you think that that transhumanism is going to be more like Kuhn or more like Popper?
Well, I mean, here's what I would say. First of all, I would somewhat correct the sketch you gave of both, because I think it might be a little misleading. So put it this way. So Kuhn's famous book, right, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, the most influential book on the nature of science in the second half of the 20th century. And people still know about it today. Now, that book is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but the secret of the book, you might say, is that revolutions happen very rarely. Okay, and so it's not a book about it's not a book about how you can turn your discipline into a revolutionary field or something. It's not really about that. It's about the fact that actually, normally speaking, science is quite conservative. And a paradigm is basically a kind of worldview, right, that scientists in a given field for a long period of time share. And along with this worldview comes what counts as appropriate methods for filling out this worldview, and so the different problems, how scientists define their problems and what they consider adequate research to solve those problems, right? All of that is fixed for long periods of time within science, and it's very difficult to dislodge that. And in fact, that's the thing that I think most ordinary people think about when they think about science, right? So science has so if you're going to do physics, you've got to learn certain kinds of mathematics, right? You have to learn how to do certain kinds of experiments, work with certain kinds of instruments, right? You have to understand certain kind of language, right? And if you don't do that, you're not doing physics, right? So in that sense, it's a quite rigid sort of framework activity, and that's what a paradigm is. And then you got all these scientists working on it. But the problem is that the paradigm is always limited, right? So the paradigm can only get you so far. And so what happens then is that you're forced into a revolution. Let's put it that way, because you realize that you cannot solve problems by using your own instruments, your own methods, and so forth, that you have to start thinking outside the box, you might say, for the first time. Now, you see, if you're an entrepreneur or an innovator, if you're one of those kinds of guys, you're always trying to think outside the box, right? But if you're a scientist, actually, you actually work with a much narrower focus. Okay. And that's one of the things that enables science to be so technical and so precise. And, all these things that we normally consider to be virtues of scientific knowledge, right? Reliable, right? All this kind of stuff. And Kuhn is really in favor of that. And so he's a kind of reluctant revolutionary, right? So, and so in the case of physics, Newtonian mechanics was the paradigm in physics, right? Basically from the early 18th century to the early 20th century. That's 200 years. And a lot was done in Newtonian mechanics, right? I mean, we had Faraday and Maxwell, and you think about all the great physicists that were in the 18th and 19th centuries. But Einstein comes along eventually, and the quantum people come along, and boom, very quickly things change. And Kuhn is big on that point too. Namely, when the change happens, it happens quickly, and then you're back to a new paradigm. right? So in other words, it settles down quickly. It's not like endless chaos and conflict and all the rest of it. So that's kind of Kuhn's view. It's a bit like a cyclical view, right? When it gets right down to it. Popper is different. Popper, in fact, when he was in a famous debate with Kuhn, which is the pretext of the book of mine that you referred to in 1965, right? Popper describes his own position, unlike Kuhn's, as being that of a permanent revolutionary. Because for Popper, see, Popper actually thinks of science as kind of a philosophy with technology, right? So in other words, he sees science primarily as a kind of critical inquiry, right? And so, so what kind of a scientist does Popper like? He likes Galileo, right? He likes Galileo because Galileo's contribution is to overturn taken for granted views about physical motion, right, that are put forward by Aristotle, and of course, overturning the kind of astronomical worldview of Ptolemy, right? And that's what, for Popper, that is what science is, right? And with regard to Darwin, right, overturning the creationist consensus, right? So there are these, so if you look at the history of science as the history of overturning taken for granted assumptions through very cleverly designed experiments and observations and stuff like that, you've got Popper's view to a T. That's what he thinks real science is. He thinks that the stuff that Kuhn talks about as science is basically just treading water, right? It's just, it's just the stuff that you do, until you actually figure out a way to challenge the underlying assumptions. So Popper actually believes that if you're a real scientist, you should be trying to undermine the assumptions of your field all the time, just like philosophers are always doing, right? Whereas Kuhn would say, no, people like that go nowhere in science. You have to wait until the science is ready for the revolution. And that's when the scientists realize that they themselves can no longer solve the problems by their own means. So that's kind of the difference between the two views. And so from that standpoint, transhumanists would clearly be on the side of Popper. Because basically, I think transhumanist view of science is that science at the moment is too restrictive, right? That there's too much consensus thinking in science. So if you ask an ordinary scientist about the possibility, for example, that we might be able to arrest or reverse aging, right? Most scientists will say maybe in rats, or something like that. But, in humans, who knows? I'm not going to waste my time studying it, right? I mean, I think this would be the attitude of most practicing scientists in the relevant fields of genetics and neuroscience and things like that. If you ask them the question about, well, can we arrest aging process of humans? They'll say, well, in principle, but it's not something worth working on in my lifetime, right? Whereas the transhumanists say, why can't we work on this problem? Why, and they kind of believe that if you throw enough money and enough determination at these problems, something will budge, and that you'll eventually get the answer, and you'll be able to then, show the naysayers wrong. I think that's the transhumanist attitude towards science. And that's why these billionaires, the Peter Thiels, the Elon Musks, all these guys, right? All these people, right? That's why they like transhumanism, right? Because they really do think that with enough capital and enough will and enough smarts, you could solve these problems, and it's only the establishment that's holding you back.
Steve, I really want to thank you for this edifying conversation. It's been great.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, Nick. It was great talking to you.